It starts in the smallest moments. You walk into a room, and for a split second, you're sure everyone else belongs to a world you're somehow locked out of. Conversations flow around you like a river you can't quite step into. Laughter feels like it's happening behind a glass wall. And even when someone says, "Come join us," something inside you whispers, they don't really mean you. You sit there, surrounded by people, yet feeling like an unanswered question. And the strange part, you don't remember a time when you didn't feel this way. There's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside. You can grow up surrounded by people, wrapped in noise, living in the middle of families, classrooms, friend groups, and still feel like you're standing on the other side of a closed door. Feeling left out everywhere isn't just about not getting invited or not being chosen. It's deeper, it's quieter. It's the sense that everyone else received a map for how to belong, and somehow yours was lost before you ever saw it. It's a psychological imprint, a subtle wound beneath the surface, something you learned long before you had words to describe it. Psychologists sometimes call this an internal narrative of exclusion, a story your mind begins telling you about who you are in relation to the world. But in your life, it never felt like a story. It felt like truth. It still does. And yet this feeling didn't appear out of nowhere. No one wakes up one day thinking, "I'm the odd one out." It's formed slowly, shaped by moments that taught you where you stand in the hierarchy of hearts. It's shaped by the times you were present but unseen, included but unimportant, loved but not fully known. You learn to blend in while feeling like you don't quite fit. You learn to stay quiet because speaking up rarely changed anything. You learn to smile at the right times, nod at the right moments, and occupy space as softly as possible. And now, as an adult, that old survival strategy follows you everywhere. Let me tell you something important. This is not a personality flaw. This is not you being too sensitive. This is a psychological pattern born from early experiences of disconnection, unpredictability, or emotional invisibility. When belonging was inconsistent, you adapted. When closeness felt dangerous or conditional, you became cautious. When you felt replaceable, you learned to make yourself small. You might not remember the exact moment it started. Most people don't, but your body remembers. Your nervous system remembers. Your inner child, the part of you that still hopes someone will finally choose you, first remembers everything. This video isn't about blaming your past. It's about understanding it. And maybe for the first time, naming what has been silently shaping your relationships, your self-worth, and even your identity. Because people who feel left out everywhere often don't realize that they're re-carrying a wound that isn't obvious to others. A wound that whispers things like, "Don't get too close. Don't expect too much. Stay on the edges where it's safer." You're easier to replace than you think. But here's the truth, buried underneath. You were never meant to live as a ghost inside your own life. There is a reason you feel this way. There is a story behind it. And understanding that story is the first step toward rewriting it. So let's go back to the beginning. To the place where this sense of exclusion was born, long before you ever had the language to explain it. If you trace this feeling all the way back, past the friendships that faded, past the awkward school years, past the moments where you stood at the edge of a group pretending you didn't take care, you eventually arrive in a much quieter place. Childhood, that strange, delicate world where you learned not just who you were, but whether you mattered. And for people who feel left out everywhere, the story usually begins with a kind of emotional misalignment. A home where the adults were physically present, but emotionally distant. A family where love existed, yes, but in inconsistent, unpredictable, or hard-to-read forms. Maybe you grew up in a house filled with noisy siblings, relatives, constant activity, but somehow your internal world felt ignored. You were there, you were part of things, but your presence never felt like it changed the atmosphere. You were an extra puzzle piece in a picture that was already complete. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe you grew up in quiet spaces, places where people rarely asked how you felt, where emotions were things to be managed rather than understood. You learned early that your inner world was not something the adults around you knew how to enter. And so, you stopped inviting them. For some, the origin lies in being the child who was easy. The one who didn't cause problems, who didn't need much, who figured things out on their own. Adults praised this. You're so mature, you're so strong, you're so independent, and you believed them until you realized that being easy meant being overlooked. For others, it came from subtle exclusion, not dramatic neglect, but small signals that accumulated. A parent who favored another sibling. A classroom where friendships formed around you rather than with you. A family dynamic where you never quite fit the mold. It wasn't cruelty, it was absence. A soft, quiet kind of emotional hunger. This is how the feeling forms. Not in one moment, but in repeated micro-moments. The birthdays where you felt invisible. The dinners where your voice was drowned out. The times you tried to share something meaningful, only to be brushed aside with a distracted later. The afternoons where you sat on the edge of conversations, waiting for someone to notice that you were drifting. But perhaps the deepest root of all is this. You learned early that connection wasn't guaranteed. That belonging was something you had to earn. That if you relaxed, if you showed too much, if you took up too much emotional space, you might be pushed out. And so you developed a habit, staying on the outskirts, watching before speaking, reading the room before choosing a single word, observing tone, body language, dynamics, everything, because part of you believed that one wrong move could jeopardize your place. That constant scanning, that's hypervigilance. It's the nervous system of a child who learned that safety depended on being careful. There's another piece to one no one talks about. When you were young, you probably had moments of pure, unfiltered loneliness that you couldn't express. Children don't say, "I feel emotionally excluded." They say nothing. They withdraw. They pretend they don't mind. They shrink. And adults misinterpret this as independence, shyness, or quietness, never realizing it's a silent plea to be pulled back in. Some children respond to this by becoming loud, demanding attention. But children like you went the other way. You made yourself smaller, gentler, easier to ignore, because somewhere along the line, you got the message that your needs were inconvenient, that your emotions were too much, or that you were safest when you asked for nothing. That's the part people misunderstand. Feeling left out everywhere as an adult is not about wanting attention. It's about wanting connection, real connection, the kind you never consistently received growing up. And as the years passed, this invisible wound became part of your identity. You entered friendships cautiously. You joined groups with one foot already out the door. You learned to expect the moment when you'd be overlooked, when you'd be forgotten, when you'd once again feel like the extra piece. Most people think childhood is something you outgrow, but the truth is, childhood doesn't disappear. It echoes. It becomes the shadow behind your choices, the quiet voice behind your fears, the invisible hand shaping how you view yourself in every room you enter. And now, without even realizing it, you carry that child with you, the one who stood at the edges, the one who waited to be chosen, the one who learned to belong by staying invisible. But this isn't where your story ends. It's simply where it began. There's something almost haunting about the way this feeling follows you, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a shadow that appears in every room you walk into, and the signs show up in ways you don't even realize are connected. They're woven into your habits, your conversations, your pauses, your tone, the way you sit, the way you breathe. You might notice it in the way you enter a group. You don't step in, you hover. You take a moment to read the atmosphere, trying to sense whether you're welcome, whether your presence shifts anything, whether you're entering a space where you're truly wanted or merely tolerated. You scan for signals, even subtle ones, because somewhere deep inside, you're expecting the familiar ache of not belonging. And then there's the way you speak, or rather, the way you don't. You wait for the perfect moment to share, the perfect opening, the perfect pause. And by the time it comes, the moment has passed, and you swallow your thought whole. You tell yourself it wasn't important anyway. You tell yourself no one needed to hear it. But the truth is, you've been editing yourself for so long that silence feels safer than the possibility of being dismissed. You might notice it in your birthday messages, the way you're genuinely surprised when someone remembers you, as if the idea of taking up space in someone's memory feels somehow undeserved. You downplay compliments. You brush off appreciation. You turn every act of kindness into something transactional because you've learned to expect so little that receiving anything at all feels suspicious. And then there's the social exhaustion that comes afterward. The way you replay every conversation, every glance, every tone shift. You wonder if you said too much, or too little, or something wrong. You wonder if someone misunderstood you, if they secretly found you annoying, if you accidentally broke some invisible rule you never received. Most people leave social gatherings with stories. You leave with analysis. You might also notice how quickly you assume you're the outsider, even when you're included. Even when people want you there, even when someone says, "Come with us," your mind whispers, "They're just being polite." You accept invitations cautiously, like you're waiting for the moment people realize you weren't supposed to be there. Then there's the strange habit of withdrawing the moment you feel even slightly overlooked. You don't fight for your place. You don't speak up. You quietly step back, telling yourself it's no big deal, even though a small part of you breaks each time. You treat your own presence as optional, so of course others start to treat it that way too. You might find yourself becoming the background character in your own life. You blend in, you adapt, you shape-shift emotionally to match the people around you. You laugh when others laugh, even if you don't find it funny. You nod along with opinions you don't fully agree with. You become the emotional thermostat of the room, adjusting yourself constantly so no one ever feels discomfort because of you. And yet, inside, you feel like a ghost. You might even experience something psychologists call the fawn response, a survival mechanism, where you become overly agreeable to maintain connection. You keep peace at all costs. You apologize for things that aren't your fault. You make sure no one is upset with you. You try to be liked instead of known, because being known feels too risky. There's also the hyper-independence, the way you do everything alone, not because you prefer it, but because somewhere along the line, you learn that needing others makes you vulnerable to disappointment. So you carry everything yourself, the stress, the pain, the weight of emotions no one sees. You've mastered self-sufficiency to the point where people assume you're fine, but the truth is, you're tired. Sometimes the feeling shows up in subtle resentment, not loud anger, just a quiet ache when you see others being included without effort. When you see people slipping easily into groups, conversations, friendships, you wonder why it never feels that effortless for you. And even though you don't say it out loud, a part of you whispers, "What do they have that I don't?" Other times, you sabotage connection without realizing it. You pull away first. You decide people don't really care. You convince yourself you're not that important to them. You build distance so you can't be rejected later. You'll tell yourself it's protection, but deep down, it's loneliness wearing armor. And perhaps the most painful sign of all, you'll never feel chosen, even when you are. Even when someone genuinely wants you. Even when you're loved. Because the wound is old, older than any current relationship, older than the people in your life today. It's the buried child inside you whispering the same story over and over again. You read the outsider. Stay small, stay quiet, stay safe. But these signs are not flaws. They're adaptations. They're the behaviors of someone who learned to survive emotional uncertainty. You weren't born feeling this way. You learned it, and anything learned can be unlearned. Even though this experience feels emotional and personal, there is a profound psychological and neurological foundation behind it. You're not imagining things. There are real, measurable patterns in the brain and nervous system that help explain why people who feel left out everywhere carry this sense of invisibility so deeply. Psychologists have long studied the impact of early exclusion, and many of their findings point to one truth. The human brain is wired for belonging. From infancy, your nervous system relies on connection to regulate itself. When connection is inconsistent, or when emotional safety isn't guaranteed, the brain develops patterns of hypervigilance. This means your mind becomes attuned to detecting the slightest shift in tone, expression, or distance. Researchers at the University of Berkeley have shown that children who grow up in emotionally unpredictable environments develop heightened sensitivity in the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threat. This doesn't mean you're dramatic or overreacting. It means your brain learned long ago that social cues could determine safety. So even as an adult, your nervous system still scans rooms, voices, and faces, searching for signs of rejection before it ever happens. Another psychological concept woven into this experience is locus of control, the belief about whether you can influence what happens to you. When you grow up feeling overlooked or emotionally sidelined, you develop an external locus of control around relationships. You start believing that inclusion is something others grant you, not something you inherently deserve. It's why you wait to be chosen instead of stepping forward. It's why you hesitate even when someone opens a door for you. Studies in the Journal of Personality reveal something else. People who experience chronic exclusion often internalize a low relational value. In simpler terms, you learn to believe you matter less to others not because it's true, but because your early environment taught you to question your significance. This belief becomes a lens through which you interpret every interaction, and lenses once formed are incredibly convincing. Carl Jung famously talked about the shadow self, the hidden parts of us we learn to bury to survive. For people who feel left out, the shadow often contains the desire to be seen, chosen, valued, known, not because it's weak, but because life taught you to hide it. Jung believed that when we ignore the shadow, it doesn't disappear. It directs our life from the dark, influencing our behaviors, our fears, our assumptions. Neurologically, mirror neurons, brain cells that activate when we observe others, also play a role. When you're constantly watching from the outside, mirroring others without expressing your own truth, your brain becomes more reactive than expressive, more observant than participating, more reflective than connected. You become an expert in others, yet remain a stranger to yourself. There's also something called compassion fatigue, not just the exhaustion that comes from caring for others, but the burnout that comes from constantly managing the emotional climate of those around you. When you're always adjusting, always monitoring, always making yourself easy to love, the invisible effort eventually catches up to your nervous system. All of this paints a clear picture. Feeling left out everywhere is not a personal failure. It's a psychological adaptation, a survival strategy shaped by environment, reinforced by neurobiology, and carried forward by habit. You're not broken, you're patterned, and patterns can be transformed. Here's the part no one really talks about, the part you don't admit to anyone, the part that stays locked behind a quiet smile and carefully chosen words. Feeling left out everywhere doesn't just hurt, it shapes you. It becomes the architecture of your inner world. And the darkest truth is that it doesn't stay in the past. It follows you into adulthood, into relationships, into every space where you wish you could finally feel at home. Because when you grow up carrying the belief that you're the extra piece, you start treating yourself like one. You no longer wait for others to leave you out, you do it yourself. You silence your needs before others can ignore them. You detach before others have the chance to drift away. You shrink before anyone can push you aside. This is the hidden suffering. You exclude yourself to avoid being excluded, not because you want to, but because you learned that closeness is unpredictable, and rejection quiet, subtle. Emotional rejection hurts more when you didn't see it coming. So you live with this constant duality. You crave connection more deeply than almost anyone you know, but you fear it just as intensely. And this fear doesn't scream, it whispers. It shows up as hesitation, as avoidance, as the urge to disappear the moment you feel too visible. Here's another truth. People who feel left out everywhere often become incredibly good at pretending they're fine. You wear the mask, you play the role, you laugh at the right places. You offer comfort, insight, warmth, everything you wish others would offer you. No one sees the hollow silence underneath. No one sees the quiet voice saying, "Don't get too close, don't get too hopeful, don't trust this completely." You can be surrounded by people who genuinely like you, friends, co-workers, even family, and still feel emotionally alone, because belonging isn't about proximity, it's about safety. And safety is something you have rarely felt. Maybe you've noticed how small things hit you harder than they should. A late reply, a forgotten invitation, a slightly colder tone, a moment when others laugh before you catch up. People tell you you're overthinking, that you're too sensitive, but they don't understand that these moments are triggers. Not because the event is big, because the wound is deep. And the deepest part of that wound is this: you've learned to believe you are forgettable, replaceable, not quite enough to anchor someone's attention or affection. Even when people love you, you question it. Even when someone chooses you, you look for the moment they'll change their mind. Even when you're included, you feel like a temporary guest rather than someone who truly belongs. And here's the harsh reality, one that hurts to acknowledge. Because you expect to be overlooked, you minimize yourself. Because you fear being too much, you become almost invisible. Because you think your voice doesn't matter, you stop using it. Because you don't want to burden anyone, you carry everything alone. The world sees your quietness as peace, but inside, it's a constant negotiating. Should I speak? Should I withdraw? Did I do something wrong? Do they actually want me here? This is the exhaustion no one talks about. The mental load of constantly questioning your place. And maybe the darkest truth of all is the one you've never said out loud. Sometimes you wonder if your absence would change anything. If things would go on exactly the same, with no space missing, No silence felt, no shift in the atmosphere. That thought doesn't mean you're dramatic. It doesn't mean you're ungrateful. It means you've lived your entire life believing your presence is optional, and that belief has carved itself into your bones. But here's the thing. A belief is not the same as truth. A wound is not the same as reality. A pattern is not the same as destiny. And everything you've learned can be unlearned. Everything you've carried can be released. Everything you've feared can be healed. But healing begins with understanding. And now that the darkness has been named, there is finally room for light to enter. Healing this kind of wound isn't about forcing yourself to be louder, more social, more confident, or more outgoing. It's not about fixing who you are, because there is nothing wrong with who you are. The path forward is quieter, deeper, softer. It begins not with changing yourself, but with finally understanding yourself. The first step is simple, but not easy. You have to acknowledge the child inside you who learned to stay on the outside. That small version of you who watched from the edges, who tried to earn love by being good, quiet, helpful, easy. That child didn't fail. They adapted, they survived, and now they're still trying to protect you, even though the danger is long gone. This is where inner child work begins, not as a trend, not as a concept, but as a reunion. A moment of turning toward the parts of you that were left behind and saying, I see you, I haven't forgotten you. The second step is to challenge the old beliefs not with force, but with gentle curiosity. When you walk into a room and assume you don't belong, pause. Ask yourself, whose voice is this? More often than you realize, it's not yours. It's the echo of people who could not offer you emotional certainty. It's the residue of past experiences masquerading as present truth. This is the beginning of identity reclamation. You stop letting the past speak for you. The third step is practicing small acts of presence, not boldness, not confidence, just presence. Saying one more sentence than you normally would. Staying in the conversation one moment longer before retreating. Allowing yourself to share a thought, even if it feels insignificant. These micro moments retrain the nervous system. They teach your brain that connection is safe, that rejection is survivable, that your voice is allowed to exist. Another healing path is shadow work. In the sense, Jung intended not a battle with your darkness, but a retrieval of the parts of yourself you were taught to hide. The desire to be chosen, the longing to belong, the need for connection. These aren't weaknesses, they're human truths. When you stop treating them like flaws, they stop controlling you from the shadows. And then there's this. You must practice letting people show up for you. Not perfectly, not magically, but genuinely. Let someone check on you. Let someone invite you. Let someone care. Because healing doesn't happen through isolation. It happens through safe connection, the very thing you've been trained to doubt. You also need to learn emotional boundaries, not the rigid walls that keep everyone out, but the gentle fences that protect your inner world. Boundaries aren't a punishment. They're a declaration that your presence has value, that your feelings matter, that your needs are real. And maybe the most important step of all, you have to stop treating yourself as the extra piece. You are not the background character. You are not the afterthought. You are not the one who belongs only when others make room. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to exist fully. You are allowed to be seen without apologizing for it. Healing won't happen overnight, but it will happen in the small moments when you choose to stay instead of disappear, when you speak instead of swallow your words, when you show up for yourself the way no one did when you were young. You're not teaching yourself how to belong. You're remembering that you already do. If you've made it this far, take a breath. Not the casual kind, a real one. The kind that reminds your body it's allowed to slow down, because everything you've been carrying was never meant to be carried alone. Feeling unwanted isn't a personal failure. It's a story you inherited before you even knew you were writing one. A story shaped by moments you didn't choose, by people who couldn't love you the way you needed, by silence that echoed louder than words. But stories can change not by erasing the past, but by refusing to let it script the rest of your life. Somewhere inside you is a version of yourself who never learned what it felt like to be chosen. Not because you weren't worthy, but because no one around you knew how to show it. That version of you is still waiting, quietly, for someone to say, you matter, you're not too much, you're not a burden, you're allowed to take up space, and maybe, just maybe, that someone is you. Healing doesn't begin with suddenly feeling wanted. It begins with refusing to abandon yourself the way others abandoned you. It begins with telling the old story. You don't get to run my life anymore. You are not an afterthought. You are not a placeholder. You are not invisible. You were never unwanted. You were simply unseen, and you are learning now to step into the light.